participants. Hello, attendees. We have 2 minutes to our webinar. Hello, everyone. We have 68 participants online on Zoom and many more on our streaming channels. And we're rising. We'll wait a minute more. Okay. Hello, namaste, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this highly anticipated Let's Talk Land webinar series 3 on the role of land restoration in disaster resilience. I am Devashini Rola. I am Research Associate and Outreach Specialist at the G20 Global Land Initiative Coordination Office, which is hosted by United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification. I would like to thank you all, our audience who are joining us today, both here on Zoom and on our live streaming channels. Today, we have a wide participation from different parts of the world. I see some relevant names here and some of our audience members who have joined us in our previous webinars as well, the Let's Talk Land 1 and 2. Today, we have gathered here for our bi-monthly webinar series, Let's Talk Land, which is our series of the G20 Global Land Initiative Coordination Office, where we talk about different issues, different emerging issues that surrounds land and land restoration and how we can protect our land. This is our third webinar, and as I said, the topic of our webinar is role of land restoration in disaster resilience. Our webinar today is in partnership with PEDR, the Partnership of Environmental and Disaster Risk Reduction Network, and United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction. Our goal today is to demonstrate the critical importance of land restoration in disaster resilience and sustainable recovery efforts by showcasing restoration projects that reduce the impact of disaster. By doing so, we explored the interaction of land restoration, climate change, and DRR to clarify how land restoration contributes to both climate change mitigation and adaptation strategies. And lastly, our esteemed panel of speakers will provide information on the latest approach and technologies that have been used by their respective agencies in integrating land restoration into disaster risk reduction and resilience planning. Now I'm pleased to introduce our esteemed speakers who will be sharing their expertise and insights with us. Today in the panel, we have Ms. Bora Musambuko, Senior Program Officer at International Union for Conservation of Nature, IUCN. Ms. Bora is an environmental and biodiversity conservation expert. Over the past 20 plus years, Bora has contributed and led on global, regional, and national initiatives and programs related to protected area management, sustainable land management, and governance. Bora is particularly interested in engaging in ecosystem and human population resilience to global environmental change, community engagement in natural resource management, and in strengthening institutional and human capacities in natural resource management. Our second speaker with us is Ms. Christine Mayer, who is a program management officer of in intergovernmental processes at the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, UNDRR. Her primary focus is on strengthening partnership and collaboration on nature-based solution and water, and integrating disaster risk reduction into relevant global policy processes. Ms. Mayer has extensive experience in fostering dialogues across sectors, disciplines, and levels of governance. Prior to joining UNDRR, Ms. Mayer has worked with with IUCN, first in the regional office for Eastern Europe and Central Asia, and later as legal officer at IUCN Environmental Law Center. Our third speaker for the day is Mr. Vincent Van Haren, who is a program lead and advisor of Making Disaster Management Sustainable, Understanding the Role of Nature-Based Solutions Zambia at the Netherlands Red Cross. Mr. Vincent Van Haren has 15 years of experience as a development consultant, and he is an experienced team leader and works closely with private enterprise, line ministers, public utilities, local governments, etc. The past 4 years, he has coordinated a global program on ECODRR. ECODRR program focuses on the implementation of integrated risk management, IRM, with disaster prevention, climate change, adaptation, ecosystem management, and recovery to enhance local resilience. Before we dive into the session, let me give you a brief overview of the agenda of today's webinar. So to start with, we'll quickly hear from our speakers, and we will hear about their insights, followed by Q&A session, question and answers round, where we will pick up your questions and ask it to our panel. So during each segment, we invite you to ask questions. Please feel free to participate and share your thoughts with us. Now, without a further ado, I would like to invite Ms. Bora Musumbuku from IUCN, who will walk us through the importance of restoration for disaster resilience, the mainstreaming of land restoration in disaster management and resilience planning, and many other insights. Ms. Bora, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. So I hope you can hear me well.
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So good morning or afternoon, everyone. And thank you, Devashri, for the introduction, and thanks for organizing this webinar. My talk will focus on land-based approaches to build disaster resilience. Next slide, please. I can't see the slides. Okay. Okay, thanks. So first of all, let's try to understand why land restoration is important for disaster resilience. What we know is that land supports life and provides a number of ecosystem services. As you know, there are many of those services, from the provision of clean water, food, or climate regulation services, cultural services, and the reduction of disaster risk. So here we're interested in services that support disaster resilience. For example, forests, especially mountain forests, stabilize slopes, and this reduces the risk of landslides. In dryland ecosystems, for instance, the vegetation helps provide long-term soil cover, and this improves the soil condition, including water infiltration, soil moisture as well. And these are very important conditions that have proven to improve drought resilience. Mangroves protect from storm surges, strong winds, which contributes to reduce coastal flooding. And wetlands can help control floods. So all those ecosystems act as a barrier to disasters. But the problem is that land is actually degraded, and it is estimated that 40% of land globally is degraded. Mostly degradation is human-induced by clearing up of forests, for instance. And a degraded land loses its capacity to produce and to generate those ecosystem services. It's all those disturbances that increase disaster risk and aggravates the vulnerability of people and also the impact of disasters on people. So the response, what is the response now? The response is land restoration, because restoring degraded land will help land an ecosystem better cope and resist to disasters. And that's the reason why land restoration is important for disaster resilience. So on this slide, so now how do we actually restore land? So IUCN promotes the use of land-based or ecosystem-based approaches, which use the benefits of that nature can provide to mitigate the negative effects of disasters on people and ecosystems, like I explained earlier. When it comes to address disaster risk and disaster resilience, you're using ecosystems. We talk about ecosystem-based disaster risk reduction. And ecosystem-based disaster risk reduction is actually a nature-based solution because it will help address many different societal challenges. In terms of societal challenges, if you look at the diagram of nature-based solutions that I'm sure you have seen many times, nature-based solutions so address several societal challenges, including disaster risk. And nature-based solutions, it's so IUCN defines it as all those actions that we implement to protect, to sustainably manage, to restore natural or modified ecosystems that address societal challenges like disaster risk reduction, for instance. So we do that effectively and adaptively, and we simultaneously provide human well-being and biodiversity benefits. Other approaches like forest landscape restoration, for instance, is also an ecosystem-based approach. And all of them, like as well, ecosystem-based adaptation, they fall under the nature-based solution concept. And this is because forest landscape restoration, for instance, through actions that will re-establish the ecological functionality across deforested or degraded forest landscapes, will also improve human well-being in addition to addressing disasters. Next slide, please. So here, that's an example of the Restoration Initiative project implemented across 10 countries and it's implemented by IUCN, FAO, and UNEP. And here is an example for Cameroon. It's pretty recent. So the project in Cameroon supports landscape restoration and sustainable use of local plant species to improve biodiversity conservation and also to strengthen sustainable livelihoods for the populations. So here, for instance, what has been done. So bamboo trees were used to restore land, and bamboos, as you may know, they're used a lot in restoration because they help conserve soil and water and also improve land quality. And this will therefore better support biodiversity conservation, for instance. But at the same time, the restoration through bamboo planting contributed to stabilize water banks and fragile slopes, to reduce erosion and landslides, and also provide a protection from windbreak to farmlands and houses. So therefore, it prevented disaster due to winds. And mangroves as well were used in this project. They were planted, and as you can see in the picture, they have grown, and it is expected that they prevent waves from reaching further inland during floods, and this helps avoid damage to houses and infrastructure neighboring the seashores. Next slide, please. Another very quick example now in dryland areas, it's the HEMA concept or protected area in a project that was implemented in West Asia and here, especially in Jordan. So this concept of HEMA has succeeded in integrating pastoralists in conservation actions and in decision-making processes. The way land was restored was through the movements of nomadic pastoralists and the livestock as well. And this was very key to pasture management because it helped regenerate the vegetation. But of course, this depends on the way sustainable grazing is managed. So it has to be managed in a way that it takes into account intensity, it takes into account the fact that we need to rest pasture. So there's all those considerations that need to be taken into account to make sure that we actually regenerate the vegetation. That will provide cover to address drought issues. And what is important in this example is it's also that it provided additional benefits in terms of strengthening traditional structures of land management. It secured land rights for the local communities. Next slide, please. So now here, so how do we, because land-based approaches are important for disaster risk reduction, we need to find ways, right, to integrate them in disaster risk management strategies. So land restoration in disaster risk reduction strategies and plan, they provide actually a huge opportunity to better coordinate sectoral policies and address objectives of all three Rio Conventions, CBD, UNFCCC, and also UNCCD. I would say that land-based approaches are the entry point for this. And as you know, the land degradation neutrality concept was also adopted in 2015. And this process explicitly calls for ecosystem approaches. And this is explained in the UNCCD LDN framework, conceptual framework, because of all the benefits that I explained earlier. So so there are multiple values, you know, of using land-based intervention. They are really of high value, and yeah, we have to remind that this is not captured in a single sector. So we really need to make sure that we strengthen the mechanism for cross-sectoral action and collaboration. We also need to improve the availability of data, the scientific basis of land-based approaches to disasters. Like, for instance, what is the scientific basis behind water scarcity, for instance, or in drylands, or the hydrological cycles in drylands? How do we understand, you know, how we have to manage water in drylands so that we avoid drought periods? And then it's important to always involve communities, like I mentioned earlier, because we'll benefit from their local knowledge, and they will help us identify those indigenous species for restoration that will provide a resistance to disasters. We know that there are many indigenous local species that have actually great benefit in terms of growing in poor soils or in areas that do not have enough rainfall. So it's very important for the communities to be with us when we do these restoration actions. And finally, we need to increase understanding of land-based approaches to disaster risk reduction to support biodiversity conservation. Like I said, it's we need to really work across sectors. And finally, and I will end my presentation here. Since ecosystem-based disaster risk reduction or land restoration is a response to disaster risk, so we have to do risk and vulnerability assessment. And this is key because it will help identify the main factors that contribute to disaster risk. It helps identify ecosystems that are particularly vulnerable, and then the appropriate adaptation and disaster risk reduction intervention will be put in place. So with this, I will thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Bora, for the insightful presentation. I want to echo the importance of coordination of sectorial policies. We do understand that it is quite important. And another thing that really resonated with me is the increasing of the involvement of local knowledge in DRR, but not just in DRR, in our approaches in nature-based solution for LDN, for all of our collective actions. We really need to incorporate and understand local knowledge. Also, for all of our participants, I would request you to please feel free to already type your questions for Bora. We will pick out your questions already and start answering them, and we'll pick them up later in the Q&A round. Now, I would like to move on and invite our second speaker, Ms. Christine Mayer from UNDRR. Christine will frame her intervention in the context of Sendai framework and the recent midterm review. She'll also highlight, in particular, the role of risk knowledge, comprehensive risk governance, and partnership. Christine, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the opportunity to speak today. I think what I will speak about will complement quite well what Bora has introduced, but I will focus more on the global perspective and also the role of some of these international conventions and frameworks that we have to help us manage disaster risks better. So I think what was quite clear also from Bora's presentation is that disasters do not have to be inevitable, and a lot of the disasters are actually caused by human-induced changes to land or to ecosystems generally that promote degradation of the environment. And I think it's really important to reiterate that our actions in this regard really matter, and the actions that we take to prevent disaster risks. What I also hear in our community that we engage with a lot, of course, is that nature is often blamed for disasters. But as we know, of course, nature is actually our biggest ally that we should utilize. So actually, in a nutshell, then, if we take appropriate action, then natural hazards do not have to turn into disasters. But we also need to think about the impacts that the land use changes that we promote actually have. And we need to take appropriate actions to conserve land, as well as soils, and to sustainably manage land, as well as water resources, because they are very much interconnected. And this is, of course, important, as Bora has already said, so that ecosystems can actually carry out the functions and provide the ecosystem services that are so essential for building resilience in societies and for our survival and livelihoods. So then the key is really that we need to make a shift from reacting to disasters to actually taking proactive action through planning, financing, and other approaches. And actually, when we look at the global frameworks that we have at our disposal, they're actually very helpful already in terms of guiding us. So most prominently for us, obviously, also as the conveyors of the Sendai framework as an organization. The Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction is the most important one, but of course it sits within the broader 2030 agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals, which also includes the 3 Rio Conventions. And I think it's quite important to frame it in this way, because climate change, biodiversity, as well as desertification and land uses are very much interconnected. And only if we look at these interconnections, then we can really focus on building long-term sustainability through a focus on prevention. But what we also know is that over the next 80 years, this is what's projected, a lot more countries, they're estimating 129 countries will actually experience an increase in drought exposure, for instance. And this is to climate change alone. But then, of course, we have other factors that weigh into this. So what do we need to do then? One trend that we see, of course, and again, Bora has already spoken about it, is the increased use of nature-based solutions, and to also adopt better regulations in terms of how do we manage land and how do we plan in terms of spatial planning. And what is important here is to take a systemic approach to look at what are the systemic risks that we are facing, what are the actions that humans are taking in order to overcome these kind of challenges. So two key outcomes that actually arrived from the recent midterm review of the Sendai framework in terms of how do we need to move forward relate to risk governance. And this, of course, includes a whole of society and whole of government approach in terms of how can we better manage interconnected risks and the systemic nature of risks when human actions really influence environmental degradation and so on. And the other key finding actually relates to how do we finance this and how can we make investments that are actually addressing risks, but also de-risking investments at the same time. So the role of the private sector is also quite important on that. What we have also seen from the review of the Sendai framework is that we're very much behind. We're not on track, and a lot of the targets are actually getting worse. One positive trend is that countries have increased the number of national disaster risk reduction strategies. So that's really good, but we still need to do a lot more on integrating different types of sectors into those strategies and making sure that we have a comprehensive risk management and governance approach so that we can adequately anticipate risks and then also strategically address them by working with nature and not blaming nature for disasters. So then what are then some opportunities that we can draw on? I would like to highlight 3 opportunities that I think can actually help us achieve those global targets that we have on land degradation neutrality, biodiversity conservation, as well as climate goals, and of course, disaster risk reduction. So one is the increasing our knowledge about risks. And this, of course, requires data and information. And here we really have an opportunity to strengthen the role of nature in terms of how we understand what is the impact on nature, but also how can nature support disaster risk reduction, and how can we live in greater harmony with nature as an ally for us. So we engage a lot, of course, in the context of the climate negotiations. And what does this mean in terms of loss and damage, for instance? How can we move beyond a loss and damage tracking system that only looks at compensating for losses and damages incurred, but actually how can we use that data that is generated through this to also help us take more preventative actions moving forward, and how can it help us build our risk understanding and knowledge on how ecosystem losses can be avoided, but also how we can restore land and other ecosystems to help us prevent disasters in the future. The same or similarly, early warning systems are quite helpful in helping us identify where are risks situated and how can we take better preventative actions in terms of better land management or better water resources management and other types of nature-based approaches. The second opportunity, and again, Bora has already mentioned the interlinkages across sectors and integrated policy making, is really to look at how do we take a more comprehensive risk approach, a more comprehensive risk management approach. What we're already doing is to try and facilitate integrated planning between climate change, adaptation, and disaster risk management. So instead of having 2 separate plans that address 2 different issues, to bring them together, and ideally, in an ideal case scenario, to have only 1 plan that addresses both of these issues of climate change and disaster risk management. But at the same time, this of course also requires, again, taking a more sectoral approach and identifying high impact sectors that need to be included, and to make sure that how we address risks is actually mainstreamed across, so that we can address multiple hazards at the same time, especially when we think about, for instance, droughts and floods, which often go together. It's good to have a comprehensive approach that looks at water strategies and water policies, but also land use policies in a comprehensive manner. And this really helps us to understand better risk information again, because if we take a more integrated planning approach, we can exchange knowledge from different sectoral perspectives and understand better what risks exist. We can also better integrate planning and provide policy coherence. And also it provides us a more long-term view to how we build resilience. And what we have found in the context of nature-based solutions is that nature-based solutions in itself, by design, can open this conversation and bring together the different types of actors and sectors across the society, also working with local communities and indigenous knowledge and other types of sources of data. So really seeing nature-based solutions as a connector between these various processes. And then the last opportunity that I would like to highlight, and I think is very much critical, is to work in partnership. Because what we see as UN agencies and other organizations is that we have a very specific expertise, and that it's really important for us to also work in partnership with other organizations that have a different type of expertise to bring different work streams together and have this more holistic and complementary approach. Maybe one thing I would like to highlight is really the opportunities we have now through the Global Biodiversity Framework, especially targets 8 and 11, which speak to the interlinkages between climate change, biodiversity, disaster risk reduction, and the role of nature-based solutions between this. And I think bringing those different strands together can really help us to move this agenda forward as a collective. And maybe the last thing I want to highlight in terms of partnerships is also the role of the G20. Of course, these webinars are organized as part of a G20 initiative that was launched some years ago. But since then, actually, we have now a G20 working group that specifically looks at disaster risk reduction issues. And one of the priority topics focuses actually on ecosystem-based disaster risk reduction, which is really great news for us because it allows us to start this conversation and to bring together the different types of frameworks a little bit more and really consider how we can increase financing for such solutions and also highlight the role of high impact sectors, which obviously also includes agriculture, land and water sectors and others. And I would stop here and thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Christine. Thank you for the insightful intervention and also for highlighting the new DRR working group formulated in the India presidency, the current India presidency. Something that perhaps might have stuck to our participants and also to me is that the sentence when you said nature is our biggest ally. We at our initiative also think that land is a beautiful canvas for humanity, and to not consider nature or land as to have a degraded picture or you know, to not be against us. So we really have to work with nature. And I also agree that we really have to work with initiatives and in collaboration. So with this, I would like to move on to our last speaker, last but not the least, Mr. Winsett van Haren from the Netherlands Red Cross. Winsett will talk about nature-based solution for disaster risk reduction, and he will also present us with a case study of Zambia. Winsett, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for your introduction and the great presentation so far. I will try to cover a lot of ground because I do think that land management matters. And I will do so by telling you a little bit about the experience the Netherlands Red Cross has in ecosystem restoration, our new partnerships, some of them innovative, and some learnings and challenges. Next slide, please. I have tried to do this along a central statement due to the complex nature of the development of successful nature-based solutions for disaster risk reduction projects. Guidance in terms of extensive scientific research is required. I will start actually with some findings of Brechtje Wezenbeek, which is the scientific director of Deltares. And Deltares is a Dutch research institute for water management. And she is a senior expert in nature-based solutions. And I attended a forum where she was a speaker last week. I think she is really a chief in this field, and I just wanted to share one or two of her key points. So she observes us that there is a lot of asks for guidebooks on how to implement nature-based solutions. But she sees as well that they are, of course, not plug and play. She observes also that there is a shift towards what she calls nature-based solutions 2.0, where nature really, the natural system really is the basis. So soil and water are guiding spatial planning and land use. And finally, she observes, or she mentions on what she thinks is highly needed, is societal change to address the multi-sectoral solutions at landscape level. This was already discussed by the other speakers. But also fair evaluation systems. Nature-based solutions is more difficult by nature, and you can't see the benefits only by looking at, for example, return on investment. And finally, she mentioned that a vision to guide developments is key. There is huge potential, but there's also huge complexity in multi-sectoral solutions. Next slide, please. Yeah, so within the Netherlands Red Cross, we have over 10 years experience with the development and implementation of what we call the prevention agenda, with a focus on the prevention of disasters and in recognition of the role that nature can play in protecting people and reducing the impact of disasters. In doing so, we have formed new partnerships, which we think also is really important in this aspect. We have set up PFR, Partners for Resilience, consisting of 4 Dutch NGOs with a particular expertise bundled, and rolled out a couple of projects with an ecosystem entry point. We work with UNEP and currently working with WWF. And we see also that the donor landscape is clearly opening to an ecosystem angle. And we continue working with, for example, the Princess Margaret Fund, the EU, the Netherlands Postcode Lottery. Next slide, please. Zooming a little bit in on a current new partnership is between the IFRC, the Global Organization of the Red Cross, and WWF International. In 2022, actually, they signed an MOU with a combined objective to move from short-term, small-scale humanitarian interventions towards long-term landscape-led response and integrating nature. And this comes from the understanding that there is huge potential in such a collaboration. However, we also observed that nature-based solutions are far from reaching their full potential. Small-scale projects that are difficult to scale up. And actually this collaboration, this program seeks to change that. Next slide, please. All right, so you're looking here at a small settlement in the Kafue Flat in Zambia, really emerged in nature. And this project is the first spin-off of the partnership between IFRC and WWF that I just mentioned. It was launched in January 23, and it starts with a proof of concept project to identify the most suitable nature-based solutions to address both flood and drought in the Kafue Flat. And in this project, we're working with 510, which is a global data team within the Netherlands Red Cross, WWF Netherlands and Zambia, the Netherlands Red Cross. It's partly funded by the Princess Margaret Fund, and of course the two country offices that WWF and the Netherlands Red Cross have in Zambia. So this is super relevant, but it's also involved. And next slide, please. Just breaking it down very quickly, what you see here in the upper part in beige, I would say, is the country border of Zambia in the upper picture. And then in the central part of the country, you see the Kafue catchment. And that darker green part is actually Kafue Flat, where the project is focusing on. And this Kafue Flat is already an area of approximately 6,500 square kilometer, which is a third of the Netherlands approximately. So it's quite vast. And what we've done so far is, well, selecting the Kafue area. Why are we working there? Because we have analyzed that the combined risk of flood and drought is very high there. And the second step was reviewing the current scene of nature-based solutions. So we set up a systematic scientific literature study and expert consultations to work towards a framework to describe the benefits of nature-based solutions and how to analyze these. And from that step, which is actually globally set up, and from that step, we're focusing into our working area, the Kafue Flats, and have drawn up 6 scenarios, which is mostly done by 510, the data team, using remote sensing, for example. Think of scenarios such as understanding the link between natural disasters and land cover change, quantifying ecosystem services lost to land cover change, but also testing the benefits of revegetation and the restoration of wetlands. And well, 6 in total. Another key step is setting up a sounding board with the research community to collect peer input on these 6 scenarios scope that we put forward. And that also has an entry point to work with external and possibly, hopefully, local consultants and consultancies. Then finally, we also are working on seeing how we can integrate this, well, scientific reviewing of the current scientific scene into the multitude of tools that are out there to well, to facilitate making decisions. So the nature-based decision support tools. Nature-based solution benefit explorer is a nice one. To enrich it with benefit identification, counting and methodology, etc. Next slide, please. So now you're looking at the complete Kafue catchment, and black outlined is the Lukanga swamp, actually, which is upstream of the Kafue flats, but they're connected. It's not very easy seen, but the Kafue River connects these 2 huge areas, and they're connected systems. So a key recommendation of a report done by the Nature Conservancy on hydrological evaluation and ecosystem evaluation is to increase the understanding of this link between these 2 floodplains. And I can tell you that even the challenges in the Lukanga swamp, so the upstream area, are complex. And the Kafue Flats also have a set of complex challenges. Linking these systems, it's even more complex. I will not go into details, but over abstraction of water, mining, soil erosion, is heavy, and to such an extent, for example, that sedimentation is severely limiting the power production of hydropower station in dam and inlet of the Kafur Flat. Yeah, next slide, please. Yeah, I think I have mentioned this mostly. What we also try to do, just highlighting this, is a comparison to BOW, business as usual. So to see what the advantages are of nature-based solutions compared to business as usual, which also has to do with what I mentioned earlier in the different evaluation methodologies needed. And then final next slide, conclusion. So when I started my presentation, I promised to give some challenges and learnings as well. From only the Zambia project, the learnings are wide-ranging. Sometimes it feels a little bit like unpacking a box, and while unpacking it, it becomes bigger and bigger. And we really see that partnerships are key in this project, and obviously also that extensive scientific research is needed. Yeah. So what we're now trying to do is, yeah, a final remark, if I may. I'm also aware that there are many examples of projects that can be effective on a much smaller scale. But for the Zambia project, the statement is, I think, really applicable. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vincent, for the great presentation. Truly, the inclusion of your case study illuminated how theories and what we talked about today can be applied in real world and grassroots scenarios. So thank you for that. I would like to acknowledge the presence of Minister Raina Sutolo from Argentina, who has been a constant support for our webinars. Thank you so much for joining and for your participation. Now we head towards the question and answers session. As we promised, we will be picking questions from our audience and directing it to our speakers. My first question is for Bora. So how can we integrate local vernacular knowledge into the governance system and current planning approaches, which often relies on knowledge from other countries, other regions or countries?
Thank you very much for this very interesting question. I would say, again, it is very key to for whatever intervention, land restoration intervention that we want to implement on the ground, we have to include local communities. And the way to do this is to use participatory approaches, but not only when it comes to, for instance, go to the ground and organize dialogues or meetings. So it has to start from the beginning, from project concept, design, and then project implementation, and also the identification, for instance, when we are in a situation where we have to select indicators to monitor now how we have been improving the land health after implementing the activities. So we should be able to identify those indicators with the local communities, and of course they will have indicators that are directly concern the local the local perspective. For instance, we have developed this participatory approach to assess rangelands and grassland health, and we included the communities, and where we were only relying on some scientific indicators, they were able to provide indicators like in terms of the palatability of species, because this also is an indicator of rangeland health. So it's very important to do that. It's very important to also speak the local language so that we make sure that everybody is involved. And then when we develop such tools that include the local knowledge, we need to make sure that they're also integrated in the national policies.
Thank you so much, Bora. Now I have a question for Christine, and I have seen this question quite repeated. I think our audience is quite interested in insurance-based financing. One specific question for you is, do you see any potential for using the proposed financing under the Global Biodiversity Framework on DRR? Could we put DRR as a criteria for prioritizing restoration protection area? So 2 questions in one.
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm not the finance expert. I know that our colleagues here, they are working a lot together with the insurance sector to exactly find solutions in how this can support restoration after a disaster does happen. And I know there's an example related to coral reefs where an insurance framework is being used to restore coral reefs after a storm surge. So there seem to be quite a few examples. Unfortunately, I don't have more examples than that, but I can check back with relevant colleagues on this. When it comes to the Global Biodiversity Framework, I think we have a huge opportunity to work more in tandem and to bring together what is in the Sendai framework and the outcomes of the midterm review, which really put financing very, very high on the agenda, and to look at targets such as target 15 in the Global Biodiversity Framework that looks at how do we incentivize good practices rather than incentivizing negative practices that have negative outcomes for the environment and degrade lands or other ecosystems even more. So I think there is a lot more that we need to do also on the regulatory and legal side. And I saw one question that I responded to as well, that questioned, don't we need a legal regulatory environment that can enable these types of decisions? And the answer is certainly yes, because through regulation, and this was a big call also during the negotiations of the Global Biodiversity Framework from the private sector, that relevant regulation can incentivize the private sector to de-risk their investments, to make sure that investments actually go towards practices that are sustainable and that build long-term resilience for everyone, for society as a whole, and also to free up some financing towards better practices. So taking financing that has gone towards negative outcomes and reinvested in other issues, and also to connect different types of hazards and look at, and this is I think where the power of nature-based solutions comes in, because it does address different types of challenges and provides multiple benefits. And if we can pool those resources through the Global Biodiversity Framework, through the Sendai Framework, through the UNCCD, through UNFCCC and so on, all these frameworks that exist, then I think we can have better outcomes on the financing side, but also for resilience.
Thank you so much, Christine. That was super interesting. My next question is for Winsett. And the question is, how important is land tenure reforms to land degradation, to address land degradation and disaster risk management?
Yeah, it's very, very important actually. Besides water and land use, I think this is one of the key aspects to take into account, and often overlooked, I would say. And an excellent question. I can't really elaborate more on how to take it into account, but I definitely echo the need to take it into account.
Any case studies from your end where you have encountered these issues?
Well, I know that in a previous project, we took it into account too late, and we had to reweight our options. It was very difficult of land that had no ownership by the direct community member we were engaging with to implement reform. It was very difficult, so we had to prioritize the land that was owned by the community, for example.
Right. Thank you so much for sharing that. I would now move towards another question to Bora. And this is from our youth activists involved in UNCCD, who ask, what effective steps can youth individuals take to pursue risk and vulnerability assessment as a field of interest?
Thank you very much. That's a very good question indeed, because we need to make sure that everybody is aware and is sensitized and is informed about land restoration to address disaster risk reduction. So, so there are many platforms, for instance, in terms of learning more about the topic. And they are also, I would say as well that it will be important for those youth groups or any individual young person to engage in activities at the national level in their respective countries. So engage with the stakeholders and try and join some youth groups in the countries that are involved in ecosystem or environment in general. So join those platforms and try and learn a bit more on those platforms about disaster risk reduction, and also try to have their voice heard, because you know, sometimes youth groups may be marginalized, but so it's important to join during the conventions, for instance, and it could be any convention, because like I said, it's very important that disaster risk reduction is mainstreamed in all conventions. So there are youth caucus, so if there are opportunities to join those meetings as well, so you will be able to really make a difference and then advocate when you're back in your country, advocate and influence such topics in the decision-making processes of your country.
Thank you so much, Bora. Now, a question for Christine. This is, again, a question that has sparked a lot of interest. This is in regards to community participation. How can we bring community on board with achieving global targets, but not just global targets? We've also seen a couple of questions where our participants have been asking, how can we bring communities in board with understanding risk and understanding vulnerability and also the importance of it?
Yes, again, this is something I think that's a core question of what we're trying to do in the Sendai framework, which very much promotes this whole of society approach, because especially looking at the most at risk and those communities that are most at risk. As an organization, we do not have presence in countries. So what we do is we work very much in collaboration with regional coordination offices of the UN and work through the country and local presence of the regional coordination offices and organizations such as UNDP, which are much more hands-on. So this is where really this partnership angle comes in quite strongly, that we should really look at what expertise do each of the organizations have and how can we work in tandem. And I think this also goes in working with civil society. We have a stakeholder engagement mechanism that we also use quite a lot, where we have different types of stakeholders represented, and where we can ensure that the feedback that we receive from different stakeholders and also from local communities, and in particular also indigenous peoples, is fed back into the global discussions that we are involved in, and really feeds into the planning process at global level, that then hopefully can also trickle down to national strategies and local strategies as well. So this is, yeah, mostly what we do, of course, promoting always the all of society approach.
Thank you so much, Christine, for concluding it well. My last question, this is for Winsett. My apologies for not picking up all of the questions, but thank you to all of our audience and participants for such a great interactive round. The last question is, what are the challenges you encounter in mainstreaming gender in DRR land restoration initiatives, and what would you suggest to overcome such potential challenges? Appreciate hearing any good practices.
Yeah, very good question, very specific question. I'm unfortunately not a gender specialist, but I would like to note that the Red Cross is known for their presence within communities. And we are also in the process of seeing how we can reshape our engagement tools to facilitate nature-based solutions, including gender. And then the focus is really on capturing indigenous knowledge, and at the same time acknowledging also that sometimes the scale is so big that a hybrid solution of remote sensing and indigenous knowledge is very interesting. And sometimes even the local knowledge is changed due to the rather sudden impacts of climate change, for example. So that is also a dimension that we are looking at. I can't really focus into the gender specifics, but from a community engagement perspective, I would reply this.
Thank you so much, Winsett. And we are almost over time. With this, we are concluding our webinar today. I would like to thank our speakers, and I would like to thank our participants. I would also like to thank our partners for this particular webinar, PEDR and UNDRR. We would appreciate if our audience could fill out the survey that we have posted in the chat, and it would really help us cater and constantly improve and cater good webinars towards you. Before signing off, I would encourage all our attendees to please visit our social media channels. We do this bi-monthly webinars, and we would love to hear from you, and all of our attendees would be getting a certificate right after the webinar. Thank you so much for participating. Thank you so much, panelists. On behalf of the G20 Initiative Coordination Office, I would like to wish you a good day ahead, or a good night, or a good afternoon. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.